Mercedes-Benz T80 looked like a vehicle from another world, partly a car, partly an airplane without wings, and partly a propaganda rocket on wheels. When you look at its long, streamlined body, it is hard to believe that it was created before the Second World War. This giant was over 8 meters long, had 6 wheels, an aircraft V12 engine, and the ambition to cross the barrier of 600, and later even 650 kilometers per hour, which at the time seemed almost unreal. The history of this vehicle began with the dream of Hans Stuck, one of the most famous German racing drivers of the interwar period. Hans was a man obsessed with speed, a hill climb driver, a Grand Prix competitor, and a figure who wanted to write his name into history, not only as a winning racer, but as the fastest man on Earth. In the second half of the 1930s, land speed records belonged mainly to the British. Malcolm Campbell, George Easton, and John Cobb kept pushing the limit further and further, using enormous machines powered by aircraft engines. Stuck believed that Germany should also hold such a record. He knew he could not build the right vehicle himself, so he turned to Daimler-Benz. 3 key figures became involved in the project: Wilhelm Kissel, the head of Daimler-Benz, Ferdinand Porsche, who was tasked with designing the car, and Ernst Udet, an aviation ace and high-ranking official responsible for access to aircraft engines. Without these men, the T80 would never have existed. Stuck wanted to drive the machine personally. Mercedes was to build it, Porsche was to design it, and the Luftwaffe was to provide the engine. That is how one of the most ambitious speed projects of the 20th century was born. From the very beginning, the project also had a political dimension. In the reality of the Third Reich, technical and sporting achievements were used as tools of propaganda. The German silver arrows of Mercedes and Auto Union had already dominated Grand Prix racing, and speed records set on the autobahns were meant to demonstrate the superiority of German engineering. In January of 1938, Rudolf Caracciola, behind the wheel of the record-breaking Mercedes W125, reached a speed of 432.7 kilometers per hour on the Autobahn near Darmstadt. To this day, that result remains one of the most extraordinary achievements ever recorded on a public road. Hans Stuck, however, wanted something greater. He was not interested in an Autobahn record, but in the absolute world land speed record. Initially, the assumption was that the T80 would reach around 550 kilometers per hour. Later, as the British kept improving their records, the goal was raised to 600, and then to 650 kilometers per hour. In some later accounts, a figure of 750 kilometers per hour even appears, although official Mercedes materials most often indicate a design target of 650 kilometers per hour. The technical project was entrusted to Ferdinand Porsche. This was a period in which Porsche was simultaneously working on many designs, including racing vehicles, and the project that after the war would lead to the creation of the Volkswagen Beetle. The designation T80 came from the Porsche office nomenclature, in which the letter T stood for type. The engineers decided on a 3-axle layout. At the front, there was a steering axle, while the 2 rear axles were driven. In practice, this meant a 6x4 configuration, 6 wheels, 4 of which received power. Such a solution was intended to help transfer the gigantic power of the engine onto the road surface. The car had a tubular steel frame, a streamlined body, and a centrally mounted aircraft engine. It was long, low, and wide. It measured around 8 meters in length, approximately 3 meters and 20 centimeters in width, including the wings, and around 1 meter and 20-something centimeters in height. Its proportions alone made it clear that this was not an ordinary automobile, but a machine designed for only one purpose: driving in a straight line at unimaginable speed. Aerodynamics was one of the most important elements of the entire project. The body of the T80 was developed with the help of specialist Joseph Mickel, while its construction was entrusted to Heinkel, a company famous for manufacturing aircraft. The result was astonishing. The car featured an enclosed cockpit, a very low-sloping nose, covered wheels, and a long tail with 2 stabilizing fins. In the middle section of the body, small wings were installed to generate downforce and keep the vehicle pressed to the ground. This was crucial, because at speeds approaching 600 kilometers per hour, the car could behave like an airplane ready to lift off from the surface. The drag coefficient was around 0.18, which even today is considered an exceptionally low figure. For a design from the 1930s, it was practically futuristic. The T80 was not intended to look beautiful in the traditional sense. It was designed to cut through the air with the least possible resistance. Every curve, every rounded edge, and every cover served the pursuit of speed. That is why the vehicle still looks today like a cross between a silver arrow, an artillery shell, and an experimental aircraft. At the heart of the Mercedes-Benz T80 was the massive Daimler-Benz DB 603 aircraft engine. It was an inverted V12 engine with a displacement of around 44.5 liters, liquid-cooled, equipped with a supercharger and direct fuel injection. Depending on the stage of the project, power outputs ranging from around 3,000 to even 3,500 horsepower were discussed. Official Mercedes materials indicate that to achieve 650 kilometers per hour, approximately 2,574 kilowatts, or 3,500 horsepower, would be required. The engine ran on a special fuel mixture that resembled a chemical formula more than ordinary automotive gasoline. The mixture included methyl alcohol, benzene, ethanol, acetone, nitrobenzene, aviation gasoline, and ether. A methanol water injection system was also used to cool the charge and prevent engine knocking. The engine itself weighed more than 800 kilograms. It had been created for aviation, but in the T80, it was supposed to propel a vehicle across the ground faster than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The transfer of such enormous power was one of the greatest challenges. In a conventional car, the gearbox and clutch must cope with torque, but in the T80, the scale of the problem was entirely different. Power from the engine was meant to be delivered to the 4 rear wheels through a drivetrain adapted for record-breaking speeds. Sources mention a hydraulic torque converter and a single-speed final drive, as well as systems designed to reduce wheel spin. The T80 featured a mechanical form of traction control that compared the speed of the front and rear wheels. If the driven wheels began rotating faster than the front wheels, the system automatically reduced the fuel supply to the engine. It sounds like a primitive ancestor of modern traction control, but in the context of the 1930s, it was an extremely advanced solution. The engineers understood that with such power, simply pressing the accelerator could destroy the tires or cause complete loss of control. The T80 not only had to reach record speed, it also had to survive its own acceleration. That is precisely why it had 6 wheels, a huge aerodynamic surface, and systems designed to tame the force of its aircraft, V12 engine. The tires and wheels were among the most dangerous aspects of the project. At speeds exceeding 500 kilometers per hour, tires operate under extreme conditions. The centrifugal forces become so immense that an ordinary tire can literally tear itself apart. In the case of the T80, the problem was even greater, because the plan was not to run on the perfectly smooth Bonneville salt flats, but on a specially prepared section of Autobahn near Dessau. The road was approximately 10 kilometers long and featured a wide concrete median strip, but at 600 kilometers per hour, even the slightest irregularity could prove fatal. Continental tested the wheels and tires on special rigs, and during tests at around 500 kilometers per hour, deformations appeared. This demonstrates just how close the entire project came to the limits of technical possibility. The engine could theoretically provide sufficient power. The aerodynamics looked promising, but the tires, wheels, and road surface remained enormous question marks. Had the attempt taken place, Hans Stuck would have been sitting in the cockpit of a machine that had more in common with an aviation experiment than with a normal automobile. The record attempt was planned for a specially prepared stretch of the Berlin-Halle, Leipzig Autobahn, in the Dessau region, now part of the modern A9 motorway. The attempt was supposed to take place during the winter, at the beginning of 1940. The car was to be painted in national colors, decorated with symbols used by the propaganda of the Third Reich. Many sources mention the nickname Schwarzer Vogel, meaning black bird, supposedly given to the vehicle by Adolf Hitler. It is important, however, to remember that this part of the story is inseparably linked with the dark political reality of the era. The T80 was an extraordinary engineering achievement, but it was also intended as a propaganda tool. The speed record was meant to be broadcast, described, and used to strengthen the myth of technological dominance. From the perspective of automotive history, the car is fascinating, but it cannot be completely separated from the realities in which it was created. It was the work of brilliant engineers, yet also a product of a system that sought to exploit sport, science, and technology for its own purposes. The attempt never took place. The outbreak of the Second World War in September of 1939 interrupted all preparations. Interestingly, testing work on the T80 continued for some time after the war had already begun. In October of 1939, the chassis was tested on a rolling dynamometer, and engineers were still analyzing the possibility of reaching 650 kilometers per hour. Ultimately, however, the project lost its purpose in the face of war. In February of 1940, the engine was removed and returned for military use. The vehicle itself was placed into storage and later moved to Carinthia in Austria, where it survived the war. The T80 never moved under its own power, never drove down the record straight, and never demonstrated whether the calculations of Porsche, Mickel, and the Daimler-Benz engineers were correct. It is precisely this unfinished story that makes the car so magnetic. It is like a great promise stopped at the very last moment. After the war, the T80 was rediscovered and eventually became part of the Mercedes collection. Today, its original body and wheels can be seen at the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart, in the section dedicated to the silver arrows, racing, and records. For many years, mainly the body was displayed, while the original chassis remained in storage. In 2018, Mercedes-Benz Classic prepared a special presentation of the T80's technology, combining the body with a recreated frame structure and a cutaway engine, so visitors could better understand the scale of the machine. The car still bears traces of the unfinished project, and that is very important. Mercedes did not try to transform it into a perfectly restored fantasy. The T80 remained a testimony to work interrupted by history. It is an exhibit, but also an unanswered question. What would have happened if in January of 1940, Hans Stuck had truly sat behind the wheel and accelerated down the straight at Dessau? The technical specifications of the Mercedes-Benz T80 remain astonishing even today. Its length measured slightly over 8 meters, its width with the side wings around 3 meters and 20 centimeters, its height approximately 1 meter and 20-something centimeters. And depending on the source, its weight ranged from around 2,800 to 2,900 kilograms. The DB603 engine had around 44.5 liters of displacement, 12 cylinders in a V configuration, and a supercharger. Projected power output reached as much as 3,500 horsepower, although earlier stages of development mentioned lower figures. Power was sent to the 4 wheels of the 2 rear axles. The aerodynamic drag coefficient was approximately 0.18. The target speed was officially raised from 550 to 600 and finally to 650 kilometers per hour. Some publications mention 750 kilometers per hour, but this value should be treated cautiously as a later or more optimistic estimate. One thing is certain: had the T80 achieved even 650 kilometers per hour, it would have represented an absolute breakthrough. It is worth comparing the T80 with the records that were actually achieved. In August of 1939, John Cobb reached nearly 595 kilometers per hour in the Railton Special. That result became the direct challenge for Mercedes. After the war, Cobb went even faster. exceeding 634 kilometers per hour. Had the T80 run and achieved its projected 650 kilometers per hour, it would have surpassed those values. Moreover, it would have been a vehicle powered by a piston engine and transmitting power to wheels, rather than a jet-powered rocket. This distinction is extremely important. Later, speed records began belonging to jet-powered vehicles that were more like wingless aircraft than cars. The T80 still represented the old school: internal combustion engine, wheels, traction, and mechanical power transfer. If it had truly traveled that fast, it could have remained for decades one of the most important wheel-driven record vehicles ever created. That is why many enthusiasts still ask whether the T80 was the greatest missed opportunity in the history of land speed records. How many examples were built? Only one. The Mercedes-Benz T80 was a single prototype, constructed exclusively for an absolute land speed record attempt. It was not a car in the traditional sense, but a tool created for one task alone. That is precisely why its value is so difficult to estimate. There is no comparable market, no second example, and no auction history. Judging it like an ordinary classic automobile would make no sense. The T80 is a museum object, a symbol of technology, a unique prototype, and part of the heritage of Mercedes-Benz. Theoretically, its value could be enormous. Since one of the two Mercedes 300 SLR Uhlenhaut cars was sold for 135 million euros, the T80, as the sole surviving example of a record-breaking project, could also potentially reach a 9-figure sum. In practice, however, it is priceless, because Mercedes would almost certainly never put it up for sale. It is one of those vehicles whose financial value matters less than its historical significance. The Mercedes-Benz T80 remains one of the most extraordinary automobiles ever built. It was a product of ambition, rivalry, propaganda, and engineering genius. It united the names of Hans Stuck, Ferdinand Porsche, Josef Mickel, and the engineers of Daimler-Benz. It had an aircraft engine more powerful than entire racing grids of its era, an aerodynamic body with a drag coefficient impressive even today, and a goal that sounded like science fiction: 650 kilometers per hour on an Autobahn. It never received its chance. War stopped the project, the engine was removed, and the car became a silent witness to an unfinished dream. And perhaps that is exactly why its legend remains so powerful. If it had run and failed, it would have been merely an unsuccessful attempt. If it had broken the record, it would have been a great technological triumph. But because it never ran at all, it remained a mystery. The Mercedes-Benz T80 is therefore not merely a record-breaking machine. It is a symbol of the boundary between dream and history, between technological genius and the darkness of the era in which it was created. It is the car that was meant to become the fastest in the world, but instead became one of the most fascinating what-if stories in automotive history.